My name's Andrea Basche. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Nebraska, and I'm going to share with you here today some of my ideas and own work about water, climate, and crops, and what we grow and what are opportunities for us into the future. So I wanted to start with kind of water and climate. And so I probably don't need to remind everyone about the risks that we're already managing when it comes to water. So if you remember 2019 all the way back when, it seems like a long time ago now, but 2019 was one of the wettest years on record. And in Nebraska, we had very unusual winter flooding event in March of 2019. This is a photo of my partner's family's multi-generation farm on the Middle Loop River in central Nebraska near St. Paul. And they've lost many farmable acres to the power of the river. And many people were in a similar situation. So 2019, one of the wettest years on record. And then where do we find ourselves today that we have a drought creeping and worsening around the plains? And what you see from the most recent drought monitor is that, oh, excuse me, didn't mean to advance yet, but what you see across the drought monitor and across the plains is that 1 year ago, we were only at 26% dry or into drought, but now we're almost 95%. And so just to underscore the point that, we're already managing many of the risks that we know will increase in intensity and frequency into the future. So the future really is now. So what I want to share with you is just some ideas that I have and have seen work in my own research about water and actually adding plants and how that can make managing for risks even more even better. So I'm going to just start here with the water cycle. I like to think about this just in the context of what we're doing as, I'm trained as an agronomist, but as people who are growing crops or thinking about, working with crops, we're trying to manage water. And so we're trying to manage the continuous movement of water through the earth system. That's the water cycle, right? And so what are those aspects that are important for us in in this work in agriculture, right? It's managing the water that falls from the sky as precipitation. So right now in Lincoln, we've probably got about 5 inches today, and many of us are not strangers to different kinds of water falling from the sky, different seasons of the year. So we're managing precipitation. We're thinking about if, we have irrigation, how we can optimize the use of groundwater or surface water. We're also thinking about, reducing losses of water from things like evaporation from the soil surface, but also, what water crops need to grow via transpiration. And we're also thinking about things such as infiltration, so water entering the soil surface, water moving over the soil surface as runoff. There's a lot of things that we do in our management that can improve the way those things occur, which I will, make more mention of here. So see, these are some of the things that we're thinking about when it comes to the water cycle. And I like to just take that step back when we think about soil, water, climate, all these things, because I really see what's happening at the soil surface as where the action is occurring, right? That the soil profile is where all of these components of the water cycle are really being regulated in and out. So where water is being taken up by crops for transpiration, where water is infiltrating that comes from precipitation, et cetera. So this is why I like to think about the soil surface as so critical to, really where the action is happening. And when I think about how we might improve water storage, I think it's really important to come back to some of the principles of soil health that I'm showing you on this slide. And these are principles that might be familiar to some of you. And these are the well-established principles that are known to improve the biological, chemical, and physical aspects of the soil such that it can continue to sustain life and function as a living ecosystem. So doing things like minimizing soil disturbance, maximizing above ground diversity through crops and livestock, and also maintaining continuous residue and roots in the soil. It's also possible that some of you have seen some of these infographics that have been created by the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service, and they're pretty popular to convey this idea that a healthy soil can improve water management. And these are some really big, exciting numbers about organic matter and, how many more gallons of water, 25,000 gallons more, or, relating those relationships to Niagara Falls. I think these are good communication tools, but I still think there's some answers, questions that we would want to answer about management and water and what this really means in terms of a healthier soil. So I'm only going to really briefly refer to some of my own research here, and I'll drop this paper in the chat after my presentation if it's of interest. But one element of the water cycle that I get particularly excited about is infiltration and how important that is to being able to conserve the water that we're getting in these more variable rain events. And so what I worked on with a colleague, and I'm showing you the reference here, was a big synthesis where we looked at different elements of soil health, as I'm showing you here, to try to understand what the largest benefit was to infiltration. And so what we found was actually when we looked at all of these different soil health related practices compared to more conventional controls, was that the most consistent and largest improvements in infiltration came from those practices like perennial crops compared to annual crop systems, and cover crops compared to no cover crop systems. Those were the ones that led to the most consistent improvements in infiltration, which is really interesting and potentially counterintuitive. I hear this a lot in Nebraska, and I'm sure some of you who are kind of in this world and hear people talk about, oh, well, cover crops use water, so that's not going to be good in a drier environment. And I think, that's one component to the story, but another component is that those roots in the soil are improving the biological, chemical, physical aspects, aggregation, organic matter, again, biological activity, all those things that can improve and facilitate water entering the soil. So I just encourage us, as I continue this first part, move into the next part of my presentation, just to remember that, it might seem counterintuitive, but adding plants can actually improve the way we are utilizing the water that's available to us. And so I want to next share some about more specifically with climate. And this is some slides. I know they're specifically here to Nebraska, but I think that the information that we know about potential changes here are very similar to what we might experience around other parts of the plains and United States. And so these are some slides that I've used from session I participated in about Nebraska's climate future about 2 years ago now, but I think they're really easy to digest, and this was prepared by the state climatologist here in Nebraska. And so some of you who probably follow this are familiar with some of the things we might expect to see with the future climate, and this is all coming from the 2018 National Climate Assessment. And so just again, these next several graphics I'll show represent the difference between the projections for the future between the middle of the 20th century into the middle of the 21st century. And so end of the 20th century, to the middle of the projected for the 21st century. So you can see that here. So we expect in Nebraska that our temperatures will increase about 2 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit. We also expect double the number of very warm days and reducing the frequency of very cold days. And we also expect, in the potential for opportunity with how we think about our cropping systems and what we're growing, that the growing season could lengthen in our area by 25%, which, again, presents some potential opportunities. And in terms of what we expect, and you can see wetter here across the US represented in blue and drier represented in brown, that we can expect across much of the US, not for those of you who are more in the Southwest who are joining today, but a wetter trend and some drying trends elsewhere, but really this important impact here that we can anticipate to see more changing in the timing and frequency of heavy water events to occur. As I've already said, we're living that future right now. And then one that I think is really important, as I start to, introduce some of the opportunities for diversified grains and legumes, is this shift in seasonal precipitation. And so what we are already experiencing and expected to continue to experience is that we will have shifts in the seasonality of water, so that we can expect more water in the winter, spring, and fall, and less in the summer, which has really important implications, especially in parts of the Corn Belt, I'm here at the kind of edge of the Western Corn Belt where we're predominantly growing summer annual crops that are using most of their water in the summer, which is when we expect there to be less water available. So I'm just showing you this nice summary here of the potential effects. And again, I know that not everyone is in the same climate who's joining us today, but I do think that some of these trends we can expect to hold true across parts of the US. And so this does maybe seem a little scary, but I would highlight a few potential opportunities here when we think about our cropping systems to take advantage of longer growing season, wetter spring, and present opportunities to do more soil conservation. And so I want to, I guess, end part of my presentation here with a kind of simple representation of different crops and how they use water. And so what I'm showing you here is a diagram of crop water use for the field crops that are grown the most widely in the United States. So that's corn, soybean, and wheat. And so I'm sure this is not an unfamiliar concept to many of you, but the idea that field crops as they're growing are typically using water in this bell-shaped curve where water use is lower earlier or shortly after planting, that it increases during vegetative growth and tends to peak during reproductive growth and then starts to decline again as crops senesce. So I show this to my students as a reminder to get us thinking about, so I teach 2 undergraduate classes, that's why I mentioned that. And we're actually talking about some of these topics this week, which is me very excited because I think it is really important for how we think about efficient utilization of the natural resources that we have, because the predominant field crops that we grow across most of the Corn Belt, corn and soybean, as I've already alluded to, summer annual crops have their peak water use in the summer months, which is when we expect there to be less water. And wheat, which we still have some significant acreage of in Nebraska and of course other parts of the Great Plains and Western US, being a winter annual crop using more peak water use in the spring. This kind of crop rotation, if you had all 3 of these crops, would be utilizing water, I would say, more efficiently because you have something that is taking up when we have peak rainfall in our region, which is typically in April, May, and June. And so this is not only more optimal from the standpoint of the current reality, but also into the future reality. And I just wanted to kind of superimpose, a few different crops to get us thinking about crops and, grains and legumes. And so I'm showing you here what would be kind of a rough imposition of, or superimposition here of alfalfa, a perennial legume, that one of its peaks of water use would occur in the spring. I want to also show another opportunity for integrating, with crop rotation for water use in the spring months, being when we would expect for different pulse crops like field peas and chickpeas to happen more in May and June. Here we would plant them in March-ish into April and harvest them late June into July. So I'm showing you another, again, imposition here. And then another crop I want to just introduce and, make reference to in terms of how we could be diversifying with different grain and legume systems is kernza. So that might be familiar to some of you. It is a perennial grain crop that's been developed by the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas. And we're doing some research with kernza here. It grows quite well in our environment. It's a really interesting dual use crop that can be used for grazing as well. It makes delicious beer and bread, I will say, from what I've had. So again, this is mainly to show that we have water availability shifting. And as that happens, we can look at the way our crops use water to take advantage of the precipitation that we have available, while also improving the soil with continuous roots, facilitating infiltration, and conserving soil resources. As we know, it's an important risk, thinking about more erosion with heavy rainfall events. And I was just going to also make the point I brought up with me today. I love chickpeas, but they grow really well even in eastern Nebraska. So this is something I just procured for my CSA this week. These were grown in Plattsmouth, Nebraska, which is on the Missouri River. So this is like, Western Corn Belt, but still the wettest and warmest part of Nebraska. So it might seem counterintuitive again to where most chickpeas are grown, but just to say that I think we can grow these crops in different environments than where they are now to really, again, take advantage of the precipitation resources that we have and the way things might shift into the future. So I'll leave with my summary here that, again, we can really think about managing all aspects of the water cycle. And again, it might seem counterintuitive that adding plants can save water, but I think we need to think beyond just using water into how plants can reduce water losses and facilitate infiltration. And that with the shift in seasonality, it does present opportunities for designing continuous cover cropping systems as well as more diversified crop rotations with anyway, I'll leave it here and welcome any questions or comments. Practical Farmers of Iowa has a great campaign here about not farming naked. And so they have t-shirts and hats and bike jerseys. If you're into that, I think it's a great slogan to remind us the value of roots in the soil. So thank you. Looks like Dan, you're muted.
My turn now. Yeah, let's open it up to some questions. And Dr. Mason, I saw you turn your camera on. So if you have a question, feel free, as maybe a couple others roll into the Q&A.
I don't really have a question, but I mean, I can just reiterate that water use and the drought, the current drought situation is just no joke. I mean, it's incredible.
So along that line, I guess I'll kind of ask a two-part question, regarding organic matter in the arid West. In eastern Colorado, our soils are pretty sandy. And then in other parts of our state and in the region, we certainly have challenges for building organic matter and sequestering carbon just because of the aridity. So I was just curious of what your thoughts are on that as far as building organic matter, but then also that water infiltration. I noticed on your study, as you were talking about the 5 principles of soil health in some ways too, and then you had the different models that you looked at with conventional and crop and livestock and no-till and cover crops and crop rotation perennial. I also come from a livestock background, so I think I'll selfishly ask too, was livestock kind of tested in some of those other systems, and what ideas do you have for folks farming in kind of more arid climates for building organic matter and improving water filtration?
I would say, I totally recognize. So I went to graduate school at Iowa State, and now I'm in eastern Nebraska. And so my frame of reference is more water than what you are all used to seeing. But I have to say that some of the really innovative things that I have seen are coming from places that have less water. And so I interact quite a bit with a farmer who's right on the border of Colorado. And I asked him this question once. I said, how do you talk to people about cover crops and water use? And he says, and I totally agree with this, that of course we're in a drought right now. So that's top of mind and real for many people, but that the very dry years are potentially fewer and far further between, but that those heavy rain events are still occurring even in very dry years. And so being able to take advantage of that is really important. But there's some really great work out of Colorado State. I imagine some of you are familiar. I can put some in the chat too. Megan Shapansky and one of her graduate students have done. They looked at intensifying wheat systems with corn and other crops, and they see really incredible benefits from that in terms of soil health, soil properties, things that would improve water storage. So again, it might seem counterintuitive, but I do think that there are people in drier environments who are doing a lot. And I think that livestock can really facilitate that and make the maybe transition or bottom line pencil out a little easier. And so that's one nice thing about being in Nebraska. There's still a lot of cattle, and people, I think, can see the value of a crop like Kernzo or see the value of grazing a cover crop. So I'll put a few of those things in the chat, some of their work after, but I appreciate that question. And I recognize my slightly wetter bias than where many of you are. So
absolutely. No, thank you. And Dan, for the risk of running a tiny bit late, I just love this question, so I'm going to ask it real quick. somebody asked, as a Western Nebraska producer, they've shifted from corn and dryland to yellow peas this year and cover crops on both sides. Very into it. Can you share insights on the economics of and local grain and how it can further adoption? Where should investors go with cash and sweat equity to improve the adoption? Certainly around economics around local grain.
That's a great question, and I, potentially love to follow up with that person. Economics always, I'll try to answer it quickly in the interest of time. I mean, economics is always a question that comes up, but it sounds like this person is already kind of figuring out how to do that. And I would encourage everyone, in the cooperative model of, the challenge for many farmers in diversifying is markets. And so what can you do in a local community to try to stimulate the market yourself and create opportunities in that region? So it's not easy, but it sounds like that person's onto something. And I think the co-op model is potentially a part of it too. So